There is a perfectly well-grown man with a silly hat on, talking to absolutely nobody, or at best, an inanimate object, the camera on top of my screen. Why is this happening? Well, I guess the best explanation would be I felt that it would help promote my vlog for me to wear this silly hat. Actually, I got married in this hat, if that provides any sort of an explanation. I've had this hat for quite a while, and I thought maybe it would be a good idea to find some other way to use it apart from just the short amount of time that I wore it during my wedding. So this is going to be my vlog, and it's going to be called The Weird West Quest. What is it I'm questing for? Well, I don't know exactly. There isn't a specific goal. I am simply looking for interesting, bizarre things that will inspire me or give me guidance in my creative endeavors. My creative endeavors are, well, as you can see behind me, there is a miniature Wild West town. I'll get into that in a moment, why that exists. But I also do a lot of writing, and I am particularly interested in a subgenre called the Weird West. The Weird West is a typical Western story, but then certain elements are thrown in to make it a little bit more interesting, give it a little more juice. And that would be things like horror or supernatural elements like magic, things that those of us in the modern world don't necessarily still adhere to, but makes for a good story. What really helped develop my interest in this, I would say, are two things. The first thing is gaming. And by gaming, I mean, yes, those sort of very nerdish, specific interests that certain people are drawn to. And I am probably part of the vanguard as far as generations go that have maintained a desire to continue to play games throughout my entire life. One particular game, Deadlands, is what got me into that, and that's something I'll be explaining to you here in a little bit. But it sort of grew from simply sitting around with a bunch of other nerds and playing games into the silliness that you see behind me. So on any one of these vlogs that I will be putting up, there's a wide variety of things that might be the subject matter. I am going to go on trips and document those and explain to you why they are interesting or why you should be interested in them. I'm also going to be talking a lot about gaming, and specifically I mean tabletop gaming or in-person gaming, as opposed to video games. Not that I'm against video games per se, and I have enjoyed them myself, but my focus right now is doing live tabletop gaming in particular. So before I go any farther, I would like to throw out this little disclaimer to you. I am just a hobbyist where it comes to history. I am not a professional. And therefore, as I am discussing things that I discover, I am inevitably going to get something wrong, whether it's pronunciation or a fact that has been altered because of new evidence, anything like that. So I would just like to point out that I am a student, I'm not the teacher. I am just a fellow student, and I'm inviting you to come along and explore these things as I do. So I understand that this is a very niche sort of fandom that I am involved with. There aren't terribly a lot of people that are still interested in Western stories that also have perhaps aliens or zombies in them. But I would say that most of my enjoyment from such a genre has come more from the gaming side, in that I really find that it's a fun combination to throw together, as opposed to simply just having two groups of individuals, people, get into a gunfight for some sort of concocted reason. So by now you're probably getting tired of all these jump cuts, but I'm afraid that that's just something you're gonna have to put up with until I get used to talking into a camera and trying to make some sort of sense. But there you go. Here comes another jump cut. So the other day I was looking over a lot of photographs that I had in my files stored on the computer, and I've realized that almost a decade has gone by where my wife and I, or our entire family, have gone out on trips and explored the world around us, and we've found some pretty interesting things. I've seen a lot of interesting historical sites, museums, or just natural formations or places of interest that most people probably don't do until they're in their retirement age. And so over the years, those things have really inspired me for various reasons.
So, why have I spent so much time, along with my wife, building all of these elaborate props that we can use when we're playing our games? And that's sort of the key question here that I'm still trying to answer. But maybe I can give it a shot. The reason why these miniatures exist and these little terrain kits exist is because there is a hobby out there that is known as tabletop miniature wargaming. Now, this is something that started way before computers, or at least, the proliferation of computers. People who were history buffs, particularly about the history of warfare, would use toy soldiers to perhaps replay out certain battles and find out, what caused certain things to happen. How did that battle turn out that way? I believe the notion of using little toys to play things out was developed by the author H.G. Wells, and it has sort of taken off. And this is a super nerdy sort of a pastime because there's so many different things going on. So before the age of computers, you needed a way to visually represent things. My character or my troops are sitting here, your troops over there. Maybe you have a sneaky scout that's over here hiding, and maybe I'm aware of that, maybe I'm not. Those kinds of things. Now, obviously, the way technology is nowadays, you can have big elaborate battles, and there's all kinds of them going on right now as people are playing on the internet with video games. But before then, battles had to be played out using miniatures. And then to sort of represent the random element of games, they started using dice. So let's say two people came up to each other and they were trying to kill each other on the battlefield. How would you determine who wins? Well, sometimes you could just flip a coin, or you could use a die. Dies are a way of generating a random number between 1 and 6, and then you could elaborate rules. So if, for instance, you had a really super awesome, experienced warrior, say Achilles, and he was going up against a no-name farmer type, well, what are the odds that the farmer type's going to win? Not very good. So you would say on a roll of 6 that that was the only shot that the farmer had of taking out Achilles. So this has evolved over the years, and people have been able to sculpt all of these miniatures and develop these kits for building buildings. It's a very elaborate hobby, and it takes quite a bit of time to get that going. My wife and I were both gaming nerds, and after we became romantically attached, this was something that we did together. My wife is a very excellent painter, and I will be showing you some of her work. I am more of the designer creator type. I do paint. The miniatures here on the board as I'm speaking were largely painted by me. A lot of the buildings are painted by my wife. So obviously there were a lot of different types of games out there when these war games took off. And people were, well, particularly in the 50s, Westerns were incredibly popular. And so it was a natural thing to develop games depicting gunfights, historical gunfights, for instance, gunfight at the OK Corral, for instance. So you could replay that out, and you would have particular statistics for the types of guns they would use and what the odds are and how effective they would be. Now, the game that got my wife and I together was a game produced by Games Workshop, which is no longer available, and it was called Legends of the Old West. Legends of the Old West was a book which I don't have in front of me, but it sort of introduced the idea of the entire hobby, as in buying miniatures, painting them, and making your own buildings and terrain pieces and collecting things. And I think that sparked both my imagination and my wife. And I don't know if I have the first building we made here, but we gave it a shot. And obviously, it was just sort of a box with a false front on it, and it sort of grew from there. So most of the items that I have here are scratch built, as in we made them ourselves, and some of them are now produced by companies because the demand has gotten popular enough. They're either made out of plastic or they are laser cut kits made out of MDF. But so this is a hobby which will be different than what my main favorite is, which is role-playing games. But this is a game in which you have definite winners and losers. The two people square off. You can throw in more players if you'd like, but by and large, it's usually one team against another, as opposed to, say, a big army. Although there are people that really enjoy, I guess, the Indian Wars, Custer's Last Stand. Although that would be very elaborate, and I don't know if I have the ambition to pull off something like that. Although I would love to play in one sometime if somebody has miniatures laying around and the whole setup ready to go. And this is the kind of thing where you don't need a referee to run the game. The two players can set it up and sort of follow rules, set the miniatures where they're going to be at the start, and play things out. And a lot of the strategy is determining distances. And so if you want to find out, for instance, that this person can shoot the driver of the stagecoach, you'll have to measure it out. And the distance that is measured out is in scale, and that might determine how difficult it is, especially if, for instance, the stagecoach driver is driving and rolling at a fairly fast speed. That's going to make him a lot harder to shoot. The other way that you would use a tape measure in this instance is for movement. Now, we all play video games nowadays, and you move by kind of pushing ahead on the joystick, and that sort of dictates your movement. But things have to be played out in turns with these kinds of games. And so how far can you move? So you would measure that out. Typically it's, sort of somewhere around 6 inches. So for your knowledge, this is a 28 millimeter scale, and this is probably the most popular scale there is out there. There are miniatures that are much smaller and smaller. Obviously, the more modern you get, the farther away people can be from each other to shoot at each other. And so you need a smaller and smaller scale to sort of represent this realistically. So now I was going to show you some of the games that I have in my collection. Obviously, Legends of the Old West is our favorite, and we still use that. I don't have a copy of the book here on me, but this is a book I got a while ago, and this is just sort of something I wanted to show you. It's a very elaborate book about how to create the scenery pieces for your war games, and that is a hobby in and of itself, and it's very rewarding. I happen to have seen a Facebook post that I put up a while ago of the first piece that I really wanted to show off by taking photos of it, and I realized it was 10 years ago, and that sort of blew my mind that I had been doing this for that long. And the piece is still here. We still use it all the time. So yes, without going into too much detail, creating these buildings and like this table and those kinds of things is kind of a fun hobby. So to throw this back into the Weird West, obviously you have people that like to play historical games. And I love that as well. And I'm not going to say that I don't want to play that. But the kinds of games where we have the most fun are things where you throw in a supernatural element. There's only so many historical battles that you could play out in the Wild West period. And sometimes maybe you just feel like, I just want to destroy some zombies, So that's also a good thing. And so there are some war games, some skirmish war games that are on the market that we obviously gravitate to that have a supernatural element. Probably what really gets us excited is the range of miniatures that they make available. So, if we need some weird Western themed zombies, so zombies in the proper period clothing, when a company decides to do one of these weird West settings, they're going to probably have that available. So this is a game called Dracula's America, and I enjoy this one. It's essentially a sort of an alternative history where Dracula has found a way to make himself Count Dracula, the one from the famous novel, has found a way to make himself the president of the United States. And of course, all kinds of supernatural things start happening. And you can play the various factions. You've got a voodooist type character. You've got, your obvious vampire hunters. You've got vampires. You've got werewolves. Those kinds of things. So it's a way to draw people who aren't necessarily attracted to the Western period into the game. This is really neat. I really like their range of miniatures that they have that go with it. Now, the other game that's kind of come out recently that we have enjoyed is Dead Man's Hand. Now, Dead Man's Hand is, at the base of it, just a historical, or I guess a game based on a sort of Hollywood idea of the Western. So, but what makes it fun is it has a way of using playing cards along with the dice. And you can play these cards as you need to do certain effects in the game. So I recommend this one. But obviously the thing that really got us going was when they decided to throw in a supernatural element to it. So this is the Curse of Dead Man's Hand. And again, I really enjoyed the range, the miniatures range. This is a straight-on voodoo sort of faction right here in the photo. Really, really dug that. And of course, there you have a skeletal sheriff. I mean, what else could you want? So I'm not particularly clear exactly what caused all the supernatural things to happen in this setting, because by and large, I was just super excited about the miniatures. But and as of yet, we have not played a supernatural version. We've only played the base game. But obviously, most of the miniatures are in our collection. So this is this entire tabletop war game hobby is something that my wife and I have been doing for quite some time. We've really built up an elaborate collection. And as I'm doing these videos, this is a subject matter that I'm going to return to. We've put all this work into all these buildings, fence lines, trees, etc. And it becomes increasingly difficult for us to travel around the country and trying to find people to play with. Even just going a couple hours down the road, we just sort of cringe at the thought of having to pack up all of our miniatures and subject them to being mangled and destroyed through travel or just misuse while we're playing. Although we do it on occasion when we find the right gaming convention, but so I'm finding that sharing it in the world that we are now living in with video conferencing, I guess, is going to be a fun way, and I'd like to share that. Now, a lot of the time we will go out and find a museum or something along those lines that have a building that we want to reproduce, or may have an idea that we feel that we need to steal. Maybe it's a little bit of an architectural thing. Or just, wandering around an old historical Wild West town, we'll find little things like, for instance, a hand pump or a trough, or things that we don't even think of that really you should have as sort of as an accent piece. So these are things that we like to do. So this is wargaming, tabletop wargaming. So I need to talk for a little bit about role-playing games. Role-playing games are my favorite, and I should be specific and say tabletop role-playing games. And nowadays, too, people are using virtual tabletops to play online, and The essential difference being that the players can be spread out to any location on the world, provided they have a internet connection and can see each other and talk to each other. But what I'm referring to, and what I tend to enjoy doing the most, are in-person games. Typically, this is done sitting around at a table in a very casual situation, but in an area where somebody won't necessarily walk in and interrupt and make a lot of noise in the background. And obviously, the one that people probably are most familiar with is Dungeons and Dragons. I started with Dungeons and Dragons. I think I was 12 years old when I started. It was a boxed game that I got from a store called Pomida, and I didn't understand it at all. I read through it and read through it, and I think the part that threw me off the most was that there wasn't a board. Kind of like what I have here, which is now a very obvious and elaborate board. So that was where I started, and obviously that game is about dragons and knights and wizards, fantasy, high fantasy to be specific. Now, shortly after the Dungeons and Dragons craze took over, they started putting out games in broader genres. So there were games for science fiction and 20s crime and horror. And the one that sort of got my mind going with Wild West was a game called Boot Hill, which was put out by TSR at the time. And I remember buying the game, and I was very excited about it. I had no one to play with, and I was staying in a big town overnight at a hotel with my parents. And I finally roped my parents into playing for just a very short amount of time because my parents were into Westerns, and I thought, hey, they would like this, right? Because it's about, cowboys shooting at each other. Well, it was a fairly complicated game, and my parents lost interest. And over time, that sort of stuck in my head, even though my interest in sort of Westerns really went away for quite some time. So later on, I generally played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons or fantasy-themed games, but I was in a comic book store and I was with some friends. We were looking through the merchandise and I happened to pick up a game called Deadlands. And Deadlands had a lot of comic book style line art in it. And as I started reading through the rules, I found that it had a certain level of humor to it. And I found that to be really appealing. So I bought the book, and pretty soon that became sort of my side game. If we weren't playing Dungeons and Dragons, we would try Deadlands. Deadlands is the theme of the game is it's an obvious Western, but it also has other elements into it. To a certain extent, it's kind of a hodgepodge. There's horror in it. There is steampunk, which is sort of fanciful inventions. So it's kind of science fiction-y in that way. And it's pretty campy. I think that's probably what appeals to me the most about it is that we don't take the game overly seriously. There's a lot of laughter taking place at the table, and I think that's kind of one of the main things we do when we get together is we want to have a good time. So right now there's a lot of different kinds of role-playing games on the market, and I was just going to go through some of the ones that I have in my collection just to kind of give you an overview. And that's what this pile of books is for. So the game on top here is a really wonderful book called Aces and Eights. And this is not a weird Western game. It is a straightforward adventure game. There isn't any sort of alternative history or magic or anything like that happening in it. It's very detailed and it has a lot of historical information in it. And we've never really sat down and played the game as it's presented. What we use this book for are ideas and specific historical information. So it has a very elaborate character background. So in role-playing games, you create a character that you're going to play throughout the game. So what this game provides is a lot of random tables or nuggets of information that you could use for your own character. to kind of come up with a background that makes him an interesting person to play, or her. And there are also some elaborate rules for the combat system you can determine. There's also like things in here for like if you want to do a very elaborate court scene to find out if you're going to get sentenced to hanging, those kinds of things. So yeah, we use this more as a reference book than to actually play the game, but I'm sure people are playing it. From what I understand, there's a new edition of this coming out here in the future. So the next thing I was going to show you is another game that I have in my collection, but I don't really use it. This is a game called Westbound. And what this is a super hodgepodge game. It's essentially a fantasy game like Dungeons and Dragons, but set in a world that is very similar to the Wild West. So you'll have orcs and elves and dwarves running around alongside human beings in a setting where you have guns and those kinds of things. So again, I like to look through these sort of things and pick out little fanciful things, in particular like the strange technology that I could use to run in my own games. So the next game is one that I also have not played for quite some time. And what this is there is a very classic, long-running, popular product called Call of Cthulhu, which is a horror game based on the stories that were published by H.P. Lovecraft. And there are lots of time periods and such that you can play this game, in which you can play this game. There are 1920s, 30s era games, which is, I believe, when it started, because the original stories were sort of in that time period. And then, you can go all the way up into the future, into space, and all sorts of different time periods. So obviously the time period of the Wild West, and throwing in all of the strange, magical, evil monsters that you might run into with Down Darker Trails is an appeal to me. It uses its own system, and I'm not overly familiar with that system. It's been a long time since I've played Call of Cthulhu. I know that it's percentile, which probably isn't going to mean a lot to anybody here, but so and this is a game where it tends more to be on the realistic side for the initial part, and then eventually you uncover supernatural craziness, and it's sort of something that's kept secret. Not people aren't walking around talking about the monster they saw, on the Oregon Trail or anything like that. So, very popular game and has a lot of really good writing in it. But I have to say that the big game here that I would say brought my wife and I together to a large extent is Deadlands. Now, since I first got that first rule book back a long time ago, the game has changed considerably. The original rules were a lot more involved, and they have streamlined the game system somewhat. And I would say that it is very good. It is a good marriage with using miniatures on the tabletop. I believe that it was originally taken from a set of wargame rules called the Great Rail Wars, which was sort of a railroad / war game. Now, what I find appealing about this to this day, obviously, is all the background material, which I may or may not use in my own games. But again, the amount of fun that people have once you start to explain the situation and what's going on, they find it very easy to get into. And I think that sort of stems from people have been exposed to the Western genre all their lives, even like at a young age. It's sort of a theme that they'll have in cartoons. And so it's easier for people to relate to them without having to have a lot of historical knowledge under their belt. They understand that there's people with guns, technology is somewhat limited. There's cowboys, there's Indians, there's strange things. And then you throw in the supernatural element, obviously, and that really sort of tips the scale. For people who don't necessarily find a Western appealing, throwing in zombies and monsters for them to shoot, as opposed to shooting other people or shooting, say, a Native American or a Mexican soldier, something along those lines. I understand that political thought needs to be placed in it. Now, personally, I feel that in a private home setting, it is sort of fun to play out the extremely strong prejudices that people may or may not have had back in that time period. And because it was a reality, and I think it's good for people to see what the reality was like. And by and large, the stories that are played out are in the right direction, and that the heroes are heroic, and the bad guys are the ones that are typically being prejudiced, or as I will probably explain in a future sitting, it's fun coming up with reasons for the players to want to fight the bad guys, to kill them, as opposed to just, oh, generically, they're monsters, they're evil. It's fun to come up with ways to make the opponents deplorable or evil or nasty, and it's sort of cathartic to have the heroes sort of take them out in a pretend sort of way. So those are some examples of current role-playing games. Like I said, in the past, there were games. Boot Hill was a big name, but that was more of a straightforward historical role-playing game. There wasn't anything supernatural or magical going on, and there were a lot of clones of that sort of came afterwards. So those are role-playing games.
Well, obviously, the subject matter that I'm going to be discussing a lot on this VOG contains a lot of fantasy or fiction, but there's also going to be a lot of reality too. So one of the main features of this vlog is going to be travel. Over the last decade and a half, I have traveled around quite a bit, seen a lot of very interesting things that pertain to the Weird West. A lot of these places are interesting sites, places with strange natural formations that are something more along the lines of a science fiction setting. Also, there are a lot of strange stories. There are also a lot of very realistic and true stories that can be found, and I want to go check out these sites. There are a lot of places that are also just sort of iconic to Westerns in general that I think would be interesting, because these things have to naturally provide inspiration. So one of my goals is to also inspire you by watching these videos to come up with ideas for your writing or for your role-playing games, or just maybe your artistic endeavors in general. If you see something that inspires you, or maybe it'll perhaps entice you to go and check out these locations yourself because they inspire you. So this is one of the first pieces that we built when we decided to get into making these pieces of terrain. It took me quite a while. All of this is scratch built, that means made by hand. And there are a lot of kits now, laser cut kits that you can get that will do pretty much the same thing. That's the boss's office, and that's sort of the room that's for rent for a short amount of time. And then down here you can see the bar, the piano. So that was just a short little preview of the kind of things that I could do when I show off the terrain or talk about how to reconstruct them. So hope you enjoyed that little tidbit. But well, this video's gone on long enough, so I guess we'll stop here. I suppose I should say something really cliche like adios amigo, something. Anyway.